There are sounds in this world that don't leave you. Rain on a tin roof at 3 in the morning. The first cry of something newborn. The silence right after thunder, that thick, heavy quiet that settles into your bones before you even realize the storm has passed over. I've heard all of those sounds. But nothing, prepared me for the sound of a royal dragon baby crying for 9 straight days. You think you know what grief sounds like. You think you understand what helplessness feels like. You don't. Not really. Not until you've stood inside the carved mountain halls of the Drakenspear Fortress, 30 feet of obsidian stone on every side, and listened to a sound that cracked the very walls. A sound that made the bravest soldiers in the Galactic Imperial Legion press their backs against the corridor walls, and look at each other like they had no idea what to do next. Which they didn't. Which none of us did. I was stationed at Drakenspear as an auxiliary human interpreter, one of maybe 11 humans in the entire fortress at that point, most of us there because the Drakari Empire had signed the Velthari Accord 3 months before and needed what they called biological translators, beings who could interface between dragon cognition and the wider galactic community. That was us. That was the job. Stand there, look calm, translate the impossible. I was not calm for those 9 days. Nobody was. Set up the world of Draknspri. Let me tell you where we were first. Because place matters, place always matters. The Drakenspear Fortress didn't look like anything Earth had ever built. We don't build into mountains the way the Drakari do. We tunnel through them, sure, we carve highways and metros and utility corridors. But the Drakari lived inside mountains, genuinely lived, not as a survival necessity, not because they ran out of flat land, but because their civilization had a philosophical relationship with stone that humans had honestly never developed. Stone was permanence. Stone was memory. A mountain that held a Drakari family's hearthfire for 1,000 years was considered a living record of everything that family had ever been. The Drakenspear itself was carved out of a mountain called the Vethkorum, which translates roughly as the mountain that has always been watching. It sat on the northern continent of Velthar Prime, the Drakari homeworld, at a latitude that produced 9 months of winter and 3 months of something that was technically spring, but felt more like a cold that had temporarily run out of energy. Outside, the air was thin and bitter. The sky ran a deep violet during the day because of the atmospheric particulate layers, volcanic ash mostly, from the 3 active volcanoes that ringed the Vethkorum range at a respectful distance. The light that came through was filtered, purple-gray, beautiful in a way that made you feel slightly melancholy even when you were happy. Snow, always snow. Sheets of it, the kind that doesn't fall straight down but moves sideways, whipping across the mountain faces, finding every gap in your thermal suit. Inside the fortress it was warm. The Drakari used deep geothermal vents running under the mountain to heat their halls, but it carried that particular smell of old stone and something else. Something like burning amber. That was the dragon fire residue, the faint chemical trace that lingered in the walls after centuries of Drakari living there. You got used to it. Mostly. The halls were enormous, of course. Drakari in their natural form average around 40 feet long from nose to tail, with wingspans that made the largest Earth aviation structures look modest. So the corridors of Drakenspear were built accordingly, arching ceilings 40, 50, sometimes 80 feet above the ground. The walls were worked stone, but worked with a precision that no chisel could have achieved. They used their breath for that, too. A sustained, focused flame at the right temperature could sculpt basalt like clay. The results were extraordinary, murals that seemed to move when the torchlight hit them. Geometric patterns that repeated at scales both vast and microscopic, carved into every surface with the patience of a civilization that measured its art projects in decades. As a human, you walked through those halls feeling roughly the size of a well-fed mouse. The human auxiliary quarters were in the eastern wing, a section that the Drakari had modified to accommodate smaller beings, lower ceilings, 12 feet instead of 50, with human-compatible atmospheric regulators because Drakari interior air ran slightly low in oxygen by Earth standards. Not dangerously so, but enough that after a week you noticed your lungs working harder than they should. The regulators fixed that. There were 142 Drakari soldiers in the fortress, 7 civilian staff, 3 diplomatic observers from the Galactic Imperial Legion, which was a different organization entirely from the Drakari military. a multi-species galactic institution that the Dracari had joined, reluctantly, 14 years ago after the events of the Skrell War made species isolation untenable. The Galactic Imperial Legion soldiers were an odd mix. Their commander was a being called Voss Thuril, a Karathi, tall, insectoid, with a compound-eye structure that meant he was technically always watching in 5 directions simultaneously. His adjutants were 2 Sulari, which were a species that looked disconcertingly like very tall humans with slightly too many joints in their fingers, and communicated in a layered tonal system that required translation even for other Sulari from different regional dialects. And then there was the royal family. 3 members, the Dracari king, formerly titled the Dreek Sorvath, which means something like the one who holds the mountain's fire. His name, the name he used among colleagues rather than the formal title, was Kale. He was old, ancient by any species reckoning, 640 years, which for Dracari put him in what they called the Middle Elder range. He looked it too in the best way. His scales were deep black with a subtle iridescent sheen, and they carried the texture of stone that had been polished by water for centuries, worn, smooth, gleaming with contained depth. His eyes were gold, but a specific shade of gold, almost amber, like firelight seen through old glass. His mate, the Dreek Sorvath's lady, was named Siren. She was younger than Kale by about 200 years, which in Dracari terms made their relationship the equivalent of a 40-year-old marrying a 32-year-old. Her scales were deep violet, matching almost exactly the sky outside, and she moved with a physical control that made you think of a large ship on completely still water, immense mass, perfect composure. And then there was the baby. The royal heir. The Dracari prince, who was, at the time I'm telling you about, 9 weeks old. His name was Ervin. He was about 12 feet long in his infant form, which sounds large until you understand that a newborn Dracari was roughly equivalent in developmental terms to a human baby. Same helplessness, same dependence, same inability to regulate their own emotional state or communicate specific needs. They cried when something was wrong, and they cried when they didn't know what was wrong, and sometimes they cried simply because crying is what newborns do, because the world is new and large and strange, and the only language available to them is distress. Ervin had been crying for 9 days. The beginning of the weeping. It started on a Tuesday. I know that sounds too ordinary. A thing like this starting on a Tuesday. But that's when it started, and I'm going to be accurate because when you tell a story like this, accuracy is the only thing you have that makes people believe you. I was in the translation office, a room the Dracari had assigned to us humans, roughly the size of a large conference room, with a long stone table and a set of crystalline communication nodes that interfaced with galactic standard communication networks. My colleague, a woman named Dr. Priya Chandrasekar from Bangalore, was running a language analysis on some of the older Dracari archival texts for the diplomatic record. I was doing maintenance calibration on the translation algorithms. We heard it at the same moment. We both stopped what we were doing, looked at each other. It wasn't loud at first, not yet. It had a quality to it, a specific quality that I'm going to try to describe accurately. It sounded like the building was breathing in a way it wasn't supposed to, like the stone walls were responding to a frequency that they weren't designed to handle. A low, resonant, sustained sound that you felt in your sternum before you heard it with your ears. Priya said, "Is that the structure settling?" I said I didn't know. It wasn't the structure settling. We found out within the hour. The head of Human Auxiliary Operations, a man named Marcus Trell who had been stationed on Velthar Prime longer than any of us, 6 years, which gave him a fluency in Dracari vocal language that the rest of us were still working toward. Marcus came to the translation office with his face doing something complicated. "The baby's crying," he said. "We can hear that," Priya said. "No, I mean the baby won't stop crying. They've been trying to settle him since this morning. Nothing's working." I asked what that meant. Marcus pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. Dracari infants cry, same as any infant, but they have a built-in physiological response. Dracari young are pack animals at the instinctual level, even though the species has been civilized for millennia. A crying infant is a signal of distress in a pack structure. When a Dracari infant cries, the adults around it respond at a biological level, not just an emotional one. They have what the Dracari call the Velthrak, the drive to resolve the infant's distress. And when the drive is activated but the distress isn't resolved, adults begin to deteriorate. Deteriorate how? Priya asked. Emotionally, cognitively, and eventually physically if it goes on long enough. He said it quietly, but the word eventually sat in the room with us for a while after he said it. The third day. By the third day, the fortress felt different. I've tried to explain this to people who weren't there, and it's difficult to communicate. The Dracari soldiers, these were beings who had trained for combat since they were 40 years old, who had served in actual war, who had scales tough enough to resist standard energy weapon fire. They were visibly struggling. Not dramatically, not in any way you'd make a story out of if you were simplifying. It was subtle. You'd walk past a guard station and the guards would be standing correctly, positioned correctly, doing everything the job required, but their tails were tucked slightly differently than normal. Their breathing had a catch in it. You'd meet a soldier's gold or green or amber eyes in the corridor, and instead of the steady, composed gaze they normally gave you, there was something raw in there. Something that looked like the beginning of panic, held very firmly in place by discipline and pride and the refusal to be undone. King Kale himself came to the translation office on the third morning. He had to fold himself to get through our doorway, which he did without ceremony, just tucked his wings tight and angled through like it was nothing. And he stood in our small room, and the ceiling was 12 feet high, which meant his head was maybe 3 feet from the ceiling, and the scale of him was something that required conscious management on our part. Not fear exactly, but a constant recalibration of your spatial sense. He said in Dracari formal register, which my translation algorithm converted into English, "I need your people's assessment." I said, "Of what exactly, Dreek Sorvath?" "Of why my son is crying." I said it as carefully as I could. With respect, Majesty, we're human translators and cultural liaisons. We're not. "I know what you are," he said, and his voice, even translated, even filtered through algorithm, had something in it that I felt rather than heard. A weariness. A specific weariness that I recognized because I'd heard it in my own father's voice once when my younger brother was very ill and nobody could figure out why. "I know what you are. I'm asking because you're something I'm not. Exterior. You're not part of the Velthrak response. You can observe without deteriorating. I need observers." We said yes. Of course we said yes. What we saw. They brought us to the royal nursery chamber, a room in the deep interior of the mountain that was, I think, the most extraordinary room I have ever stood in. It was carved in a perfect hemisphere, maybe 60 feet across, with a ceiling that rose to a gentle dome 40 feet above. Every inch of the walls was carved with what Marcus told us were blessing figures, the Dracari equivalent of protective symbols, creatures and geometric patterns woven together. In the center, on a raised stone platform that had been lined with something soft and dark, something that looked like woven volcanic fiber. On this platform, 12-foot, 9-week-old Ervin was crying. I want to be careful about how I describe this because I don't want to be melodramatic, but I also need you to understand. The sound at this distance, being in the room, was physically intense. Not just loud, though it was loud. It had a resonance, a specific frequency quality that hit the inner ear and the chest cavity at the same time and produced a sensation that I can only describe as profound unease. Not pain. Just your body's system saying quietly and firmly, "Something is wrong, something needs to be fixed. This is not acceptable, resolve this immediately." I understood the Velthrak then, on a much reduced scale, but I understood it. I wanted to fix it. Every cell in my human body wanted to fix it. Siren the Queen was curled around the platform, her body making a loose circle, her head resting near her son, her eyes open, and watching him with an expression that I have no species-specific language for but that I recognized completely. Every mother who has ever sat beside a sick child and felt utterly helpless, that expression was on her face, scaled up to something enormous and violet and ancient, but completely, unmistakably the same expression. Kale came in behind us and the sound hit him. I watched it hit him. His whole body reacted, a subtle ripple along his spine, his wings involuntarily beginning to half-spread before he consciously controlled them back down. He went to stand near Siren and they touched foreheads briefly, which is a Dracari gesture of, I want to say, solidarity, but it's more specific than that. It means something like, "I am with you in this even though I cannot resolve it." We watched for 4 hours. During those 4 hours, every Dracari doctor in the fortress came and went. We learned through Marcus's translation what they had tried, which was essentially everything. Feeding, the baby wasn't hungry, or if he was, he wouldn't take sustenance. Temperature adjustment, no effect. Physical contact, Siren hadn't stopped holding him or staying within touching distance for 3 days. Harmonic tones, Dracari have a tradition of specific sounds used to calm infants, deep resonant chest vibrations, and those had worked on him in the first week. They weren't working now. Light changes, atmospheric changes, acoustic dampening to give the baby quiet worse. Every intervention had either no effect or made things slightly worse. "Have you called a galactic medical team?" Priya asked. Marcus translated. Kale's response was complicated. The short version was, yes. The Galactic Imperial Legion's Medical Corps had been contacted on day 2. The Legion's standard response time to Velthar Prime from the nearest relay station was 4 to 6 days. They were coming. But 4 to 6 days, with this sound filling the mountain, with the Velthrak working on every Dracari present, was not a comfortable timeline. The Galactic Legion arrives. They arrived on the 6th day. I was in the main entry hall when their transport came in. The fortress had a carved landing bay on the south face of the mountain, shielded from the worst of the weather by a natural rock overhang. And the Legion's medical ship came in clean and fast and settled onto the stone with the practiced ease of a vessel that has made 100,000 planetary landings. Commander Voss Thurl received them. I was there as interpreter. The Legion medical team was 4 beings. A Karathi physician whose name I'm going to approximate phonetically as Thesavar. A Sulari medical technician. A being from a species I had not personally encountered before, the Vrethali, who were aquatic in origin and moved on land in a kind of walking tank filled with their native atmosphere. And 1 human. Dr. Amara Osai, from Accra originally. She had been with the Galactic Legion Medical Corps for 11 years and she told me when we had a moment to talk, more infant distress cases than I could count, across more species than I knew existed before I joined. She was calm, that was the first thing I noticed about her. Not performed calm, real calm. The kind that comes from having stood in a lot of difficult rooms and not run away from any of them. "Tell me what they've tried," she said before she even went to see the baby. I told her, she listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. And no physical abnormalities in the infant. No injuries, no visible distress response beyond the crying. None that their doctors could identify. "But they're Dracari doctors," she said, "which means they're extremely good at understanding Dracari physiology, but they may be working from a framework that's too internal." She stood up. "Can you take me to him?" I took her to him. She stood in the nursery chamber for a long time without touching anything, without approaching the platform. Just standing in the entrance, watching. I watched her watch Ervin, and I watched what happened on her face. She heard the sound. Of course she heard it. She felt it, same as I had, the physical response, the unease, the pull to fix it. But she didn't let it move her. She stood there and she absorbed it and she processed it, and then very slowly, very carefully, she walked toward the platform and she asked Siren, through me, if she could approach the infant. Siren's eyes went from violet dark to a lighter shade, Dracari emotional response registering in the iris, Marcus had explained. The lighter the iris in a distress situation, the more extreme the distress. Siren's eyes had been very light for days. They went lighter still when Dr. Osai asked, not from hostility, but from something I understood. From the desperation of a parent being asked if a stranger could approach their child, and the terrible hope that the stranger might be the one who finally knows what's wrong. She said yes. Of course she said yes. Dr. Osei's assessment. Dr. Osai spent 3 hours with Ervin. She brought equipment I didn't recognize. The Legion Medical Corps had access to technology that the Dracari medical tradition didn't use, because the Dracari had historically been a closed culture medically, developing their own systems in isolation for centuries. The Legion's tools were cross-species developed, built to interface with a wide range of biologies. Thesavar and the Sulori technician assisted. They moved quietly and carefully, and Siren watched every movement with those 2 light eyes, and Kale stood in the far doorway because he could not be in the room for too long without the Velthrak starting to affect his control. We waited in the corridor. Marcus paced. The Legion's adjutant stood still. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall because my legs were tired and I was on my 4th day of disrupted sleep, and there was no point pretending otherwise. When Dr. Osai came out, her face was neutral in a way that told me she had information and was deciding how to convey it. She asked for a private space. We went to the translation office. Kale came, folding himself through the doorway again, and Siren, who fit more easily, came too, though her presence in that room meant the rest of us were very aware of the scale differential in a way that didn't quite become claustrophobic but came close. Dr. Osai sat down, she put her equipment case on the table, and she said, "Ervin is physically healthy, completely healthy. No infection, no injury, no metabolic irregularity, no neural abnormality. His body is functioning exactly as a 9-week-old Dracari infant's body should function." She paused, waited for Marcus to finish translating for Kale and Siren. "The crying," she continued, "is not a response to physical distress." Another pause. "In multi-species infant psychology, which is my subspecialty, there is a category of distress response we identify across many species that we call unresolved imprint searching. It occurs in species with complex bonding biology. It means, put simply, that the infant is searching for something that should be there at a biological instinctual level and cannot find it." She looked at Kale, then at Siren, and I could see her calibrating how to say what she said next. "In Dracari bonding biology, a newly born royal heir undergoes what your traditions call the first naming, yes. A bonding ceremony in which specific individuals are formally bonded to the infant through a centand resonance ritual." Kale made a sound, not words, just a sound. Marcus went very still. "The Velthrak ceremony," Kale said quietly, "the one we did not complete." And the room went quiet in a way that I will not forget for as long as I live. The thing that was missing. Here's what had happened. I learned it in pieces over the next few hours, from Marcus, and from the formal translation session that followed Dr. Osai's assessment. When a Dracari royal heir is born, there is a ceremony that happens in the first 3 weeks. The Velthrak ceremony, different from the Velthrak response I mentioned earlier, though related etymologically. In this ceremony, 5 beings are formally bonded to the infant heir. Not emotionally bonded, not just socially bonded, biologically bonded. Through a specific ritual involving the infant's first breath fire, even infant Dracari can produce a very small flame within days of birth, and a corresponding resonance produced by the 5 bonded individuals. The 5 bonds are traditional: the mother, the father, the eldest living relative, the designated guardian, and the 5th, which, in the royal tradition, was always a being from outside the immediate family. A being chosen specifically to give the heir a connection to something beyond their own bloodline. The Dracari called this being the Vethiv, roughly translated, the stranger who becomes kin. Ervin had received 4 of his 5 bonds. The 5th, the Vethiv, had not been performed. And why? Because the being who had been chosen for this role, a Dracari elder from a distant mountain hold, a figure of great significance in Dracari culture, someone whose lineage went back 11 generations to the founding families, had died. 3 days before Ervin was born, unexpectedly, of a sudden cardiac event that the elder's own doctors had not anticipated. In the grief of loss and the chaos of a birth arriving early and the demands of the diplomatic situation with the Legion and a dozen other things, the ceremony had been delayed, and then delayed again. And then the window for it had passed, because the Velthrak ceremony had to be completed within the first 4 weeks, during what the Dracari called the open window, the period when the infant's bonding biology was fully active and receptive. Ervin was 9 weeks old. The window, as the Dracari doctors understood it, had closed. And Ervin's biology, at the deepest level, was searching for the 5th bond that his instinct said should exist, that the partial ceremony had told his body to expect, and could not find it. So he cried, and cried, and cried. The weight of impossibility. After Kale explained this, after the whole situation was on the table, the room was quiet for a long time. Dr. Osai was taking notes, or pretending to. I think she was actually giving everyone a moment. Thessavar, the Karathi physician, spoke in the Legion's standard language, which the translation node handled. The medical literature on Dracari infant bonding biology is limited. Is there documentation of cases where the ceremony was completed outside the standard window? Cale's response, as Marcus translated, there are 3 recorded cases in our history in which the window was extended. One was 300 years ago. One was 600 years ago. One was in our pre-written history, meaning we have oral records only. And in those cases, the window was extended by the presence of an extraordinary bond candidate, a being of sufficient, Marcus paused, searching for the right term, resonance. A being whose nature somehow met Ervin's instinct at a level deep enough to reopen the window, at least temporarily. What does sufficient resonance mean biologically? Thesivar asked. We don't fully know, Cale said. The cases are too few to analyze clinically. Our tradition says the being must be someone Ervin's instinct recognizes as true, as genuine, as carrying something that his deeper self responds to. An infant 9 weeks old cannot cognitively assess someone's character, Thesivar said. No, Cale agreed. He cannot, but instinct is not cognition. Dr. Osai looked up from her notes. So what you're saying, she said carefully, is that the only thing that might work is finding someone whose presence, on a non-cognitive level, feels right to a 9-week-old dragon baby, and you have no clinical framework for predicting what that means or who that person is. Cale looked at her. Yes, he said, that is what I'm saying. The suggestion. It was Marcus who said it. I want to give him full credit. He thought of it, he said it, and I think he was right. He said it quietly, not as a grand proposal, just as a thing that occurred to him that might be worth saying out loud. What about bringing people in? Candidates, not selected by us, not chosen logically. Just people, different beings. And see if Ervin responds differently to any of them. Cale said, we cannot parade strangers through the royal nursery. Not strangers, Marcus said. People who are already here, people in the fortress. We have, 150 Dracari, the Legion diplomatic team, 11 humans. That's 160-something beings. Some of them Ervin has been around already, even briefly. We're not doing anything random. We're just giving his instinct the opportunity to do what it's designed to do, if it can. Cale was quiet. Siren spoke. Her voice, even translated, had a different quality than her husband's, lower in the frequency range, somehow. She said, he has been in that room with every Dracari in this fortress. The doctors, the soldiers, the staff. I have watched his response. It does not change. Then the answer, if there is one, Marcus said, is probably not a Dracari. And this moment, is the one that I remember most clearly, because of what Siren said next. She said, then bring me every non-Dracari in this mountain, tomorrow morning. I want to see who my son looks at. The morning of the 7th day. We came in single file. It was early morning, early by the fortress's internal clock, which ran on Velthar Prime's 27-hour day cycle. The violet light came through the mountain's high ventilation shafts at an angle, throwing long, slanted columns of dim color across the corridor stones. The crying, you could hear it throughout the fortress, as always, this deep, sustained resonance that lived in the walls now, that you woke up to and fell asleep to and stopped consciously registering except in the moments when you suddenly remembered to notice it, and then it hit you all over again. Thesivar led the procession. Behind him, the Sulori technicians, then the Vrethali physician in their walking tank, the soft, rhythmic sound of their atmosphere processor clicking in the quiet corridor. Then us, the 11 humans. Me, Marcus, Priya, and the others, in various states of preparedness for a 7 in the morning walk to the royal nursery. I was tired, we were all tired. I had been running on about 4 hours of sleep per night since this started, and the quality of those 4 hours was not good because the crying reached even our atmospheric-regulated quarters, muffled but present, a subsonic reminder that something was not right in the mountain. None of us knew what to expect from this. Marcus had framed it as giving the baby's instinct an opportunity, which was a sensible way to think about it. But in the practical sense, what we were actually doing was walking into a room with a crying infant and hoping that one of us might, somehow, feel right to him. On whatever level a 9-week-old dragon processes the world. I had thought about this the night before, lying in my bunk. About what it would mean to feel right to an organism that had no cognitive framework for evaluating you. To be selected not for your qualifications or your history or your intentions, but for something that existed before any of that. Something that your whole life hadn't built in you so much as revealed. It felt like being asked to be seen rather than assessed. That was the only way I could think about it, and I wasn't sure which possibility was more frightening, being seen and found adequate or being seen and found lacking. The presenting. Queen Siren received us at the nursery door. I had last seen her 6 hours earlier, when Marcus and I had brought food to the door for her attendance. She hadn't left the nursery in 4 days except to speak with us. Up close in the low corridor light, she looked different than she had during the formal sessions. Her violet scales were duller, not dirty, just dimmed, the way a person's skin looks when they haven't slept properly for a week. Her eyes were the lightest I had seen them. She held herself steady, but I could see what it cost her. She looked at us, all of us, the Legion team, the humans, and I think she was doing something that parents do when they're very frightened and trying not to show it. She was cataloging, assessing, trying to see something in our faces that would tell her one of us was the answer. She said in Dracari, "Thank you for coming." Marcus translated for those of us whose Dracari was insufficient. She gestured us forward. We went in one at a time. That was how it worked, not a parade, not a crowd, but one being at a time entering the nursery chamber, approaching the platform, spending time near the infant. Siren watched. Thessavar had monitoring equipment set up in a corner, reading Ervin's biological response data. The Karathi went first, Thessavar himself. He moved carefully, his compound eyes rotating slowly as he approached the platform. He spent maybe 5 minutes near Ervin. The crying didn't change, not louder, not softer, continuous, sustained, unchanged. The Sulori technicians went next, separately, same result. The Vrethali physician could not enter. Their tank was too large for the nursery door, so they observed via a visual link that the Legion team had set up. Ervin gave no visible response to the visual. Then the humans. We went in order of seniority, which meant Marcus first. He went in and was in there for several minutes, and when he came out his face was carefully neutral, but his eyes looked tired in a new way. The crying had not changed. Priya went next, then the others. I was last. I don't know why I was last, the ordering had just worked out that way. And I remember standing in the corridor outside the nursery door, waiting for the person before me to come out, and listening to the crying that I had been listening to for 7 days, and feeling something that was hard to name. Not dread, not hope exactly. Something between the two, a waiting state, a held breath. The feeling of standing at the edge of something without knowing if it had a bottom. The person before me came out, shook their head slightly. I went in. I'm going to try to tell this accurately. I walked into the nursery chamber and I stopped just inside the doorway, the way I'd watched everyone else stop. Let my eyes adjust to the lower light. Let the sound settle onto me. And it did, it always did, that physical resonance that hit your sternum and made your hands want to do something useful. I looked at the platform. I looked at Ervin. He was in the way that infants of any species are, almost abstractly small in relation to the space around him. 12 feet long, which I know sounds large, but in that 60-foot domed room on that raised platform, with the carved blessing figures watching from every wall, he seemed small. He was moving, the way distressed infants move, not flailing, more of a persistent, uncomfortable shifting, trying to find a position that resolved something that couldn't be resolved by position. His scales were a deep burnished bronze color, lighter than his father's black, that seemed to capture and hold the light differently in different moments, shifting subtly between brown and copper and almost green. His eyes were closed. He was crying. I walked forward, slowly, the way you approach any distressed creature, moving without sudden gestures, keeping your presence steady. I got to within maybe 15 feet of the platform and I stopped. And then Ervin opened his eyes. I don't know what I expected, gold like his father's, or violet like his mother's. Instead, they were a color I didn't have a name for, something like the sky on Velthar Prime at the edge of morning, that specific moment when the violet starts giving way to lighter tones but hasn't committed to either. Gray-violet, or violet-gray, a color that seemed to change depending on which way the torch light moved. He looked at me. I looked at him. The crying, the sustained, 9 days continuous, wall-shaking, bone-deep crying, stopped. Not gradually, not quieting and trailing off. It just stopped in the space between one breath and the next. I don't know how long we looked at each other. 10 seconds, 30, time does something strange in moments like that. The silence was so sudden and so complete that it had a texture. The absence of the sound was itself a physical thing, a new presence in the room rather than just the removal of the old one. Ervin made a sound, a different sound, small, quiet, something that I can only describe as the sound an infant makes when it recognizes something. Not words, not language, just a small, complex vocalization that meant, in whatever pre-language lives below cognition, oh, there you are. Behind me, I heard Siren make a sound that I will not try to describe. THSSAVR's data. I came out of the nursery after about 20 minutes. I had stayed as long as Ervin stayed calm, which he did completely for the entire time I was there. And the corridor was different than it had been. Everyone had stayed. That surprised me. Usually after your turn was done, you'd go back to quarters or the translation office or wherever. But they'd all stayed, and when I came out and the silence from inside the nursery was apparent, the silence that was, after 7 days, extraordinary, they were all looking at me. Marcus was the first to speak. He said, his eyes were open. Yes, I said. That's the first time his eyes have been open without crying. I didn't know what to say to that. Thessavar moved toward me, his compound eyes rotating. Your biological readings during your proximity to the infant. I'd like to review them with you. I wasn't wearing monitoring equipment, I said. No, he said, but I was monitoring the infant. And what I can tell you is that during the time you were in that room, every single biological distress marker in Prince Ervin's readings went from acute to nominal. He paused. All of them, simultaneously, in under 10 seconds. The corridor was quiet. The deep resonant crying, which had been our constant backdrop for 7 days, was absent. The absence of it made the fortress sound like a different place entirely, lighter, higher, more itself. Dr. Osai appeared from around a corner. She had been back with the monitoring equipment. She looked at me with an expression that was equal parts scientific interest and something more personal. Are you familiar with the concept of precognitive species recognition? She asked. Not specifically, I said. Different species have different biological frameworks for fundamental compatibility assessment. In humans, we have partially analogous systems, instinctive trust responses, the speed at which we form attachment assessments in early infancy, certain kinds of biological resonance that manifest as first impression phenomena even in adults. The Dracari-Velthrak bonding system operates on related principles, but is significantly more developed, more specific. She paused. What Ervin's biology recognized in you is not a character assessment. It's not based on who you are in terms of your history or your intentions. It's something more fundamental than that. A resonance match. Your biological signature, your presence as a living system, corresponds to something his bonding instinct was searching for. It's like she searched for an analogy, like how a key works. The key doesn't know the lock doesn't know the key, but the shape is right. I stood in the corridor of a carved mountain on an alien world and thought about being a key. The question of the ceremony. Kale called a formal session that afternoon. By this point, with Ervin quiet, which he had remained for the first time in 7 days, the atmosphere in the fortress had changed. The Dracari soldiers were still professional, still at their posts, but something had lifted from them. A physical pressure released. You could see it in the way they stood differently. The way the tail positions had changed. The way the guards' eyes, when you met them in the corridor, were darker and steadier than they'd been. The session was in the fortress's formal chamber, a high-ceilinged space, carved with the mountain's oldest decorations, the ones that predated the current dynasty by 6 centuries. Long stone benches for advisors. A central speaking floor of black basalt so polished it reflected the torch light. The Dreek Sorvath's chair, which was not a chair in the human sense, but a raised platform with specific dimensional relationships to the speaking floor that conveyed formal authority. Kale was there. Siren was there, which was unusual. She rarely attended formal sessions, not from exclusion but from personal preference. Her presence meant this was significant. Thessavar and Dr. Osai represented the Legion medical team. Marcus and I represented the human auxiliary. The Dracari senior physician, an elder named Veth Korin, was there, as was the fortress's senior chamberlain, a Dracari named Sorrel whose scales were so dark they were almost invisible in the shadowed parts of the room. Kale spoke first. His formal voice was different from his corridor voice, larger, more deliberate, the kind of voice that has given many speeches over many centuries and knows its own weight. The situation is known, he said. Prince Erwin requires the fifth bond. The window we believed was closed appears not to be. The candidate appears to be the human called. He used my name, who is present here. He paused. This was for translation, but also, I thought, for the weight of the next thing he was going to say. The question before this session is whether the Velthrak ceremony can and should be performed, and if it should, what its implications are. Vethkorin spoke next. In medical Dracari, which was a formal register that Marcus translated with occasional hesitations. The ceremony is possible. The infant's window appears to have been extended by the proximity response, which, in the 3 historical cases, is what also occurred. The biological conditions can be met. My concern is the implications of a non-Dracari Vethiv. Kale, say your concern plainly. A Vethiv bond is lifelong. It is permanent. The heir will be biologically connected to this human for the duration of both their lives. The human will be aware of the heir's distress at a distance, not precisely, but as a persistent low-level signal. The heir will seek the human's presence in times of acute distress until adolescence, after which the bond becomes more ambient, contextual rather than urgent. But in infancy and childhood, the bond is active. This means the human must be available. Not always present, but reliably accessible. Which, given that this human is a citizen of Earth and we are on Velthar Prime. I understand the logistics, Kale said. There are also implications for the human's biology over time, Vethkorin continued. The bond affects the human as well as the heir, though we have no data on what the effect on a human specifically would be. In Dracari Vethiv bonds, the bonded individual experiences what we call the Sorvath echo, a sustained low-level awareness of the heir's emotional state. In non-Dracari beings, he stopped. We do not know. We have never done this with a non-Dracari. The room was very quiet. Dr. Osai said, "May I speak?" Kale, you may. From a galactic medical ethics standpoint, she said carefully, the person being considered for this ceremony needs to give informed consent. They need to understand what they're agreeing to. They need to understand the unknowns, including the biological unknowns specific to their species, and they need to be given genuine choice. No social or diplomatic pressure applied. Kale looked at her for a long moment, then he said, "Agreed." And then everyone in the room looked at me.